Hello, this is Sam Simon, also known as Dementia Man, for my weekly blog. Today is May 27th, Memorial Day, 2024. And I'm going to talk about Memorial Day in the military. I'm going to start with some remembrances, but end with a note about my troublemaking time in Army JAG back in the mid 70s. There's a note about that in my play, Dementia Man. But I do want to start back with just remembering, which is what Memorial Day is, to remember those we've lost who served um, our country. Well, let me start with those who didn't fall. My World War II relative, my uncle, Joe Simon, served in the Navy, and he was actually at Pearl Harbor on December 7th when there was a bombing. He survived and served a long tour of duty during World War II. Then his son, Steve Simon, my cousin, served in Vietnam and saw active combat on the ground in Vietnam and for a period of time. He did come out with a variety of PTSD and some various ailments, though he survived for some time, but he has passed away. Then there is my brother-in-law, Major General retired Eugene Fox, and he served in Vietnam as well, and saved a number of lives, but had obviously a tremendous career in the military. He went to West Point. His sons, Ed Fox and Eric Fox, were also West Point graduates. And Eric, his youngest son, just retired from a full career in the military. And then there was, I guess, me, the guy who served in the Army JAG. But I'm going to go back. There's one other non-family member, but this young kid who played in our backyard, a neighbor. He played with our kids and our son, William Hecker. His mom, Nancy, and my sister, Evelyn, were best of friends. And William Hecker served in the Iraq War. And shortly before his scheduled return home was killed by a bomb under the car. And we remember the late Major William Hecker for his heroism, but also for, I smiled the time as a kid and growing up and playing in our backyard as well. So back to my time in the military, I had a 4-year tour of duty scheduled for Army JAG. I was in ROTC and received a scholarship and persuaded the Army. It took a lot to persuade the Army to let me go to law school, even though they very much needed second lieutenants. That was after I graduated college. But I did go into the Army JAG and I served at Fort Lee, Virginia. And I did cause the Army some trouble. I did. I had just come back. If you remember last week, I had been working for Ralph Nader. Immediately after law school, I persuaded the Army to give me a deferment for about 8 months. And but I still had to serve. So I went to Fort Lee, Virginia, and served in the Judge Advocate's office there for 2 years. I later came back to Washington, D.C. and worked for the Army Chief Trial Attorney. But I want to talk about an incident while I was at Fort Lee, Virginia. This was the era when Richard Nixon was president, and he had a program designed to encourage young poor, often African-American kids to enlist in the Army to help fill the ranks of the enlisted corps. And as a result, and over a period of time, there developed within the military pretty profound problem of young kids with taking drugs. Some addicted to it, but a drug problem. Richard Nixon declared a drug amnesty. In order to address this issue, he said to these young people, if you're on active duty and you have a drug problem, turn yourself in and you won't be court-martialed. This was also an era where marijuana was, sort of the hippie days, was still sort of a popular drug. I can still remember the day when a young African-American soldier came to my office seeking help. He said that under the drug amnesty program, he had turned himself in, and he thought he was going to have amnesty, that there would be no negative consequences. Well, one wasn't too bad, at least not to me. He was immediately put into the hospital, and his time in the hospital was considered bad time, added on to his enlistment. Now, that would have been just fine, even if he recovered, whatever his addiction was, and served honorably. Except after that, he was told that he was going to be administratively discharged from the Army under less than honorable conditions. And it turned out that this was going to be the standard, and was the standard handling of anybody who turned themselves in for drugs. They then were they weren't given a court-martial, so they didn't have any time in jail, but they were administratively discharged from the Army under less than honorable conditions. That's reminiscent of something 40 years later, when people who acknowledged that they were LGBTQ were administratively discharged from the Army under less than honorable conditions. Now that too has changed. And you know what? The Army, the Pentagon announced that for all those lesbian and queer and other cross-gendered individuals who were given less than honorable discharges, that the Army is going back, or the military is going back from all services, and they're changing those to honorable discharges. So I thought this was really terrible, and I heard it way back in the mid-70s, and I tried to get it changed. I couldn't. So I wrote an article for whoever would publish it. It turned out it was published by The Nation magazine. So you have to remember, I was on active duty. And I was challenging the military. And I wrote, now I'd submitted my article for approval first, but when I got it accepted before the government approved it, I went ahead and authorized it to be published under my name as an active duty captain, writing, and it was called the Ketchen Drug Amnesty. And I told how terrible it was that these young people were being administratively discharged with this less than honorable discharge. So one day I got a call from the Judge Advocate General's office and asked if I didn't really mean that as a letter to the editor. And it was the only time I've taken the Fifth Amendment, because I knew that letter to the editor was an exception to the regulation that required articles to be approved before they were published, and mine wasn't. So I was in deep trouble. And indeed, it turned out that the Secretary or Assistant Secretary for Public Information of the Army wanted to court-martial me. And as a result, when the Judge Advocate General's office called and said, "Didn't you really mean that, wink, wink, as a letter to the editor?" I said, "I can't answer that question. I took the Fifth Amendment." Well, what eventually happened is that my boss, who was a major and I was a captain, called me into the office and said, "Well, the Army is giving you an official letter of reprimand and it's going in your official file. And here it is." And he put it in my file. He said, "Now this meeting is over." I said, "Okay, the meeting's over." That was weird. And then he told me, "The Judge Advocate General would like me to tell you, good job. And if we had more lawyers like you, we'd be even better in the Army." Well, I still have a letter of reprimand in my office, but I did get discharged with an honorable discharge. Um, and the Army, to deal with me, got me out of the field and put me in the office of the chief trial attorney of the U.S. Army. And I did some government contract litigation. But that was me causing trouble, even in the Army. And I think I'm going to, notwithstanding my Alzheimer's and everything I do, I think there's more trouble to cause. I am going to see if I can get someone, maybe my congressman, to contact the Army. And for all those young people, those individuals, even so many years later, who were given a less than honorable discharge, maybe they can go back and also change that too. So, still thinking about those we've lost, but thinking how also to make our country fairer to everybody who served.